Ahoy everyone, it's Jeff, aka Godless Scummer. Welcome back to my channel. I'm very delighted once again to have Tim O'Neill back on the channel. Tim is the author of the blog historyforatheists.com. And Tim is also, actually, since the last time I spoke to him, is also now on YouTube and has a podcast running as well, which is well worth checking out. I've invited Tim on to this today to talk about the destruction of the great library of Alexandria. But before I sort of bring Tim in, I'm just going to begin tonight's proceedings by reading out a little quote. And this quote is history is full of people who, out of fear or ignorance, lust for power, have destroyed knowledge of immeasurable value, which truly belongs to us all. We must not let it happen again. Now, that quote seems familiar to anyone. That is from Carl Sagan quote from the series Cosmos. And one of the things he was referencing when in that quote was lamenting the destruction, the burning of the great library of Alexandria. And the story, the sort of long-held story is that the great library of Alexandria was where all the knowledge of the ancient world was stored, and in an act of vandalism by fundamentalist zealot Christians was destroyed, burned to the ground, and all the knowledge of the ancient world was destroyed. And that event sort of was sort of led us into the Dark Ages, which took us hundreds of years to recover from. But is that really what happened? And this is what I brought Tim onto this today, because I think there's a little bit more to it. There's a little bit more to this story than people realise. And so, Tim, is that what happened?
Yeah, short answer, Jeff, no. There's a much longer answer, which I'm going to give, I suppose, in a moment. But I think it's really good that you, first of all, thanks for having me back on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted, Tim. I'm delighted to have you back.
And good to be able to talk about a topic in some depth. And this one does actually, like a lot of these pseudo-historical myths, the real story is more complicated. Takes a while to get your head around and to understand, and is also much more interesting than the myth. The myth is a nice, useful little moral parable. You know, once there was this great library and it was full of the wondrous learning of the Greeks and Romans, and then evil Christians came along and destroyed it, boo, and then we got plunged into a dark age and we must never let it happen again. That's a beautiful little fairy tale, and it's a nice moral fable. The only problem is that it didn't happen. So and it's interesting that it's good that you started off with a quote from Sagan, because most of the current understanding of what happened with the Great Library of Alexandria comes from Sagan and Cosmos. And there's a great blog by a fellow called Peter Gainsford, who's a classical historian, called The Kiwi Hellenist.
I've read some of his stuff, actually.
Really good stuff. And he's written an article on this where he's actually tracked on Google word searches and mentions in print publications of the Great Library. And you see it goes along until you get to 1980, and then it shoots up. And what happened in 1980? Well, that's where Carl Sagan brought out his PBS TV series Cosmos, which was a groundbreaking series, one of the most watched television shows of the 1980s. And he brought out a best-selling book that came with it. And as I was just saying to you before we began, I read that book about 12 times when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And absorbed it, and really thought that I really liked the way he kind of approached science from a historical angle. And it was only years later that I had to unlearn most of what he taught me about history.
And I'm happy you stated that, Tim, because obviously I'm here on an atheist channel, so make this very clear. We're not dogging on Carl Sagan here, okay, people? But we just, we all have to acknowledge, as great as the man was as a science communicator or whatever, maybe history wasn't his thing.
Brilliant. He was brilliant. He was brilliant on science. He was not so good on history. And that makes sense. He studied science. He wouldn't have studied history past high school level, and he would have studied history in America in the 1950s. So I think we can forgive him. But I think it's important to remember that if you're getting your history from popular writings by scientists, you're probably not going to be getting good history. And the other interesting thing about the story of the Great Library is, a great repository of science and technology and reason and wonderfulness destroyed by Christian's Dark Age. That story is a very different story to one that you would have got, say, if you asked someone in the early 19th century about the Great Library. Then the story would have been about how it was a symbol of the stagnation of the ancient world, how it was a symbol of how moribund ancient learning had become, and how it was kind of like an ivory tower that was disconnected from anything practical or useful. So the stories that we tell about the Great Library have actually changed over time. And so the current story that you hear in popular conversation and online and so on is actually quite a new one. And it's one that largely comes from Carl Sagan. But maybe we can sort of talk a little bit about that myth, and then we can talk about the reality, and then get eventually. I want to get on, of course, to the story of what really happened, and
sure,
to the Great Library and how it actually came to an end.
Well, so I mean, I think it's a good thing to get into the myth, and I think obviously you hinted, yes, that Carl Sagan may be somewhat responsible for popularizing this myth, but this was a myth he believed it, so he learned this from somewhere. So it didn't start with. Obviously, it did not start with Carl Sagan.
It didn't. It actually began with Edward Gibbon in 1778 or so. So Gibbon
I've heard of this guy. I've heard of this guy. Yeah.
So Gibbon wrote
Roman Empire. That book.
That's the guy. He wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is this huge, thumping, great, multi-volume history of the end of the Roman Empire. It's a brilliant book in many ways. I've read it. I've got several copies. It's a brilliant book in many ways. It was beautifully written and remains a monument of prose style to this day. And it was a remarkable piece of research, given when it was written, given what he had available to him. But it's not very reliable as history, partly because he was writing in the 1770s, and so he didn't have a whole lot of material, a whole lot of access to archaeological and epigraphical and a whole lot of other material that we have now. But secondly, because he wasn't writing as a modern historian writes, which is looking very carefully at the evidence and coming up with an objective, preferably reasonably objective analysis as to what's most likely to have happened. He was writing in the 18th century, and he was writing polemic. So he was writing to make a political point. And the political point, one of the political points he was making was that Christianity and organized religion is bad. And so any opportunity he got to get a kick in at Christianity, he did. And so he took a version of the story of the Great Library of Alexandria and used it as an anti-Christian argument, even though he's kind of fiddling around with the evidence in order to do so. We'll come back to what Gibbon did, I think, towards the end. But maybe if I could talk a little bit about what the Great Library was.
Yeah, well, that was. I think that's a good place to go, because I think that's a very good place to go with this, because I think there's probably some misunderstandings about what exactly the Great Library of Alexandria was and what it was not.
Yeah,
and I think this may be the time to sort of shed a bit of light on this.
Okay, so what you often read about the Great Library is that it was this singular and unique collection of all the learning of the ancient Greek and Roman world, or even beyond that. It was the largest library in the ancient world. That bit's true. It contained anything between 500,000 and 750,000 books. It was this great center of learning and study. And it was a great center of science and technological innovation, and it was almost like this sole repository of ancient learning, and so its destruction meant that we lost all of that information. There's kernels of truth in what I just said. So yes, it was a great center of learning and study, but most of what I just said is not true. So to begin with, when we're talking about the Great Library of Alexandria, if you went to ancient Alexandria in a time machine and in your very fluent ancient Greek said, take me to the Great Library of Alexandria, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. Because when we're talking about the Great Library, what we're talking about is the book collection of the Museon, or the museum. So the Museon was the temple to the 9 muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts and sciences, which was part of the palace complex in the ancient city of Alexandria. The book collection is what we're talking about when we're referring to the Great Library, but the institution was the Museon, and it was a temple, but it was also a center of study. Most of the temples to the muses were also centers of study, because that's kind of what the muses were all about.
This is obviously would have been the Ptolemaic period.
Yeah. So Alexander the Great conquered Egypt on his way to conquering most of the rest of the world, and founded a city in northern Egypt, which became the great port city of Alexandria. He founded several cities that he named after himself because he was that kind of guy. But this is the one that everyone remembers. The reason it's the one everyone remembers is that it went from being effectively a military camp, which is what he founded, to being a major port. And it was the conduit between the Far East, particularly India, and the Mediterranean world, because basically ships sailed across the Indian Ocean up into the Red Sea, and then they caravanned goods across land to Alexandria, and then from Alexandria it spread out across the Mediterranean world. So Alexandria became big, became rich, and was a major political and major economic center. When Alexander died, his generals divided his empire up amongst themselves, and so one of his generals, Ptolemy, got probably the richest bit, which was Egypt. Egypt was immensely rich. So Ptolemy the First was the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the Ptolemaic kings, who were basically the final dynasty of the pharaohs, ruled right up until Cleopatra the 13th. That's the Cleopatra,
the famous Cleopatra,
the famous one, yeah. And she was the final Ptolemaic ruler. So that was right up until the mid first century BC. So who founded the Great Library, or who founded the Museum? Legend says it was Ptolemy the First. His name is Ptolemy the First Soter. It's probably more likely his son and successor, but we don't really know. But what did they found? Well, they founded, as I said, a temple of the 9 muses. So there was a priest, several priests, and there was actually, they worshipped the 9 muses there, but they also did a kind of built a sort of a institution around it for study, and the institution was attracted the best minds of the Greek world. That was the idea. This was a prestige project for the Ptolemaic dynasty, and people have got this idea that you can just wander into the Great Library off the streets. I've read people saying things like, anyone could walk in and could study. That's complete bullshit. If you tried to walk in to the museum, you would be quickly and rapidly and roughly thrown back into the street by the palace guard. This was in the palace complex. It was the Ptolemies, it was the Ptolemies' plaything. And it was a way of saying, this is the kind of ruler I am. So it was a statement. I am a civilized ruler. Look, I've got a temple to the muses, and I've got these great scholars who study there.
And I was gonna ask you sort of a question about that, because when I've heard you talk about this before, obviously you mentioned that there were other great libraries in other kingdoms. I mean, was this sort of a thing though, that for rulers, that this was all, in the sort of Greek world, this would have been a sort of good sort of a thing for them to, say, look, this with our kingdom here, look, we're all great learning centers. And it was a bit of a prestige, and maybe possibly a bit of a pissing competition with certain kingdoms. I mean, I'm thinking of Pergamon, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. I mean, this is not to say they didn't actually value learning. They did. That was one of the reasons they did it. But yeah, this was one of the things you did. You founded temples that showed that you were pious and you were showing great respect to the gods. You maintained ancient traditions and ceremonies that showed that you were again were maintaining the way in which things should be done. They were quite conservative, the ancients. And then you founded institutions of learning and libraries because that showed that you were a person of culture. You also sponsored art and sculpture and so on for the same reason. But yeah, and this kind of gets back to what I was saying before about the part of the myth being that the Great Library was this singular and unique institution, and therefore its destruction meant that we lost all that learning. That's complete bullshit. But there were thousands of libraries. There were even quite a few very, very big libraries. So you just mentioned the Great Library of Pergamon, which was probably the main rival to the Great Library of Alexandria. And there's a cute little story. It's probably not true. There's a cute little story that because of the rivalry between Pergamon and Alexandria, the Alexandrians, the Ptolemies, banned the export of papyrus reeds to Pergamon because all writing was done on papyrus, and pretty much all papyrus was exported from Egypt. So what's a good way to strangle your opposition? Well, make sure they can't copy any new books. And so according to the story, they banned export of papyrus to Pergamon. And as a result, the librarians of Pergamon invented parchment. So they worked out a way of making a writing material out of sheep and goats because they had plenty of goats.
Yeah, I'll just ask you a quick question, actually, because something I noticed MathPig saying in the chat about the Great Library, that he'd heard that they stole books from other libraries as well. I don't know if that's true, but I've heard you tell a story. We don't know if this is true or not, but I think I've heard you and a couple other people tell this story. There's allegedly that they would ships that come into the harbour or whatever that they would search for books or something, or there was I heard another story somewhere else about when they would try to get some of the works from Athens or something, where they bought them, but then they sent them back the copies they'd made, not the originals. So
yeah, so both those stories were ones that were told about the Great Library. Again, we've got to be careful. These things are stories, and the reason people remember them is that they're good stories.
They're good little anecdotes, I think. But
the first one is that according to one writer, I think it might have been Plutarch, all ships coming into the port of Alexandria were searched. Any books on board were then confiscated and were copied, and then only then was the ship allowed to leave. Unlikely to be true, because that would really put a big sort of disincentive on anyone coming into your port, just in case a book was on board, and because it took weeks or months to copy a book. So I don't know if that's true, but I think that story is kind of explaining how comprehensive the Great Library tried to make its collection. They tried to make sure they had a copy of everything. The other story, again, I don't know if it's true, but I wish it was. I hope it is. It's a good one. They asked Athens for the originals of the works of the complete works of Aristotle, and so they can copy it. And after lots of wrangling, the Athenians agreed. And they paid it, but they paid a kind of a ransom of, the Egyptians paid a huge ransom of gold to say, yep, we'll definitely give it back. And then instead of giving back the originals, they forfeited the gold, kept the originals, and sent over the copies. Again, it's a great story. I don't know if it's actually true or not, but again,
it's one of those. You hope it's true, but you got to treat that with a little, like a lot of these stories. You got to treat them with a pinch of salt.
But I think what you do with these sorts of stories is think about, well, what do they mean? Not did that actually happen, but what does it mean? I think in both those cases, it means that they were looking to have an extremely comprehensive collection, and they certainly seem to have got together a huge collection. As I mentioned before, all the evidence indicates that the Great Library, the collection of the Museum, was the biggest library in the ancient world. Now, what you often see are these huge numbers. So the one that usually gets thrown around is 500,000 books. And then you also get 700,000 books, or even 750,000 books. These numbers are unlikely to be accurate, because we also get other numbers. We get a whole range of numbers which go as low as 40,000 books, according to Seneca, or even 54,800 books, according to Epiphanius. And what we don't get is lower numbers in the early sources and higher numbers in the later ones. So that's an indication of the library growing. They're all over the place. So what we can pretty safely say is that no one actually knew how many books they had at any given point.
Why does this remind me of modern newspapers? Why does this remind me of modern newspapers reporting numbers on protest marches? One side greatly exaggerates it, the other maybe underplays it a little.
And that's pretty much what's happening. If you have a look at who's giving the big numbers and who's giving the small numbers, that's pretty much what's going on. So what can we say about the size of the collection? Well, I go into this in some detail and look at some of the scholarship on this. There have been estimates made. I know in military history, when you're dealing with ancient medieval military history, the rule of thumb is divide any estimate by 10. So if it says Attila the Hun invaded Europe with an army of 500,000 troops, it's probably about 50. Right? So and I think that kind of works with the Great Library. I won't go into the detail, but when we compare the size of the Great Library's collection to rivals such as, for example, the Library of Pergamon or the Great Library of Celsus at Ephesus, it's probable that the Great Library was maybe about 50,000 scrolls. Now, 50,000 scrolls isn't 50,000 books, because you can have some scrolls that will have like 10 short works in it, and other works take 40 scrolls. So we don't know how many works were actually in the Great Library. But what we can say is that it was a big library. What isn't true is that it was somehow uniquely huge. It was probably not that much bigger than, say, Pergamon or Ephesus or the Library of Trajan in Rome. The other thing that we definitely can't say is that its contents were unique, because when we look at what we do know, we haven't got a catalogue, but we've got fragments of information about what was in it. There's nothing to indicate that it was somehow stockpiling stuff that wasn't found elsewhere. So we kind of know what sort of works, even though most of the works that it contained are now lost. We kind of know what sort of works were in there, and this kind of brings us to the question of, well, what were they doing there? And if you listen to Carl Sagan, you can find his monologue about the Great Library on YouTube. You get the impression that what they were doing was science, that this was a great center of science and technology. This is what they were doing at the Great Library, and that's not true. It's kind of true, but it's not true.
It's sort of proto-science. You could, at best, really. Really.
But that's true, and I'll come back to that point, Jeff. But I think the other thing we need to have a look at is, what did they value as learning, and what do we value? Obviously, we value science a great deal, but they had a very different perspective on the world. And if we have a look at the works of and the main focuses of, say, the directors of the museum, and we've got the names of quite a few of them, the main thing that they were focused on was poetry, not science. And if you think about it, this is a book collection associated with the Temple to the Nine Muses, and the muses were mainly muses of various forms of poetry and theatre, dance and music. So I know that doesn't quite fit the idea that they were, building flying machines and planning to fly to the moon or something, but this is largely what they were doing. And the reason poetry was so important to them is that for them, poetry wasn't something that, pale chaps who can't get girlfriends sit in their bedroom and write because they're feeling sad, which is, or hipsters recite in coffee shops. Poetry to them was literally a connection to the divine. And poetry that had lasted, particularly works like by poets such as Hesiod, Pindar, and especially Homer, were not simply fun books works that you read for the story. They were literally insights into the mysteries of the universe. So poetry was really important. And this was a major part of what they were doing. They were collecting various copies of these great works, comparing them, producing critical editions of them, producing commentaries on them, and also breaking down the language and producing what were effectively the first dictionaries. So that format that we see in our dictionary, where you have the word, some information about its grammatical form, a definition, and there's some examples of its use, and then maybe its etymology or origins. That whole format was invented at the Great Library of Alexandria.
Yeah.
So was alphabetical ordering. That was alphabetical ordering was something else that they seem to have come up with.
I think, I think people may have this idea in their head of this being sort of like a little bit like a modern university with sort of individual faculties, but that's not that's not what happened. And generally, people who studied there would have been wouldn't have just been studying one thing. They would have been studying all sorts of different, mathematics, science, poetry, and obviously philosophical ideas.
Yeah.
So
exactly. These people were polymaths, but I think probably the important thing to remember is each of them were working within a philosophical framework. And the idea of studying other stuff, the poetry, but even things like physics, ethics, politics, and so on, was to fit it within that philosophical framework. Effectively, what they were trying to do was answer the question of what is the best way to live. So what they call eudaimonia. What's the best way to live? And in order to answer that question, you have to understand the world. How do I live in the world? Well, okay, let's first understand the world. In order to understand how you live with other people, you have to understand the structure of societies. You have to understand politics. You have to understand ethics. In order to understand how to thrive physically, you have to understand anatomy. You have to understand medicine. You have to understand herbalism. This is why they're studying all this stuff. There wasn't as you say, there wasn't a department of physics at the museum. You had people who were maybe a bit more interested in physics, or what they call physics, different to what we call physics. But on the whole, they were all polymaths, and they were all trying to work out what was going on within their chosen philosophical system. So yeah, when people sort of say, well, Eratosthenes at the Great Library of Alexandria, one of the directors of the museum, estimated the circumference of the Earth, and he was doing science.
I'm going to say his name. I've heard that man's name a lot in the last few years since the scourge of flat Earth sort of reared its head on the internet again.
Well, one of the myths about Eratosthenes is that he was the guy who came up with the idea that the Earth was round. He didn't. That had been developed by the Pythagoreans centuries before. He started with that as his assumption. He then used some quite good but fairly basic geometry to come up with an estimate of the size of the Earth.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to denigrate what he did, but the idea that he was some kind of scientist, his nickname was Beta, which meant like second rate, because he was kind of like second best at everything, but not best.
I just had this horrible image of Jesse Lee Peterson in my head then when you said that. Beta.
But that was kind of like a bit of a nasty nickname that his colleagues gave him. But it's because he was very much a man of his time. He studied everything, and he wasn't sort of great at anything, but he was good at everything. And I think when we're thinking about the kind of science that they were doing, you mentioned it before. It wasn't our science. It was a kind of inductive proto science that was not an end to itself, but was very much serving the purpose of this wider philosophical, mainly ethical and metaphysical program. So a lot of the stuff that sounds very scientific to us from the ancient Greek world, just to divert a little bit on that, actually wasn't very scientific at all. They didn't do a whole lot of experiments. They did experiments, but they didn't do them systematically. They didn't have peer review. They didn't have empiricism. They did measure some stuff, but not systematically. So they weren't doing science in the way that we do it. So when people talk about ancient Greek science, they're usually using the word science as either they're misusing it or they're using it as a shorthand for this inductive semi-proto sort of science that they were doing as part of this metaphysical project. So when people talk about atoms, for example, and you read any textbook on atoms,
you read my mind. I was going to ask that next.
So you read any textbook on atoms, on the first page it will say the ancient Greeks discovered atoms. They came up with the concept of atoms. Well, not really. What actually happened was the ancient Greeks were sitting around, maybe at the Great Library or in the museum. They were sitting around thinking about the concept of matter, and they were saying, well, okay, if I take a piece of marble and I cut it in half, I've now got 2 pieces of marble. If I cut them in half, I've now got 4. Cut them in half, etc., etc. At what point do I get to a point where I can't cut anymore? Where I get to something that is uncuttable, and that's what the word atom means. Atomos means uncuttable. This was not a scientific question; it was a metaphysical question.
I was going to say, it sounds more like a thought experiment, doesn't it?
It was, and a lot of their science was, and which meant they came up with some stuff that was correct, and they came up with other stuff that was completely wrong. So Aristotle said, using a thought experiment, if I drop a heavy weight and a lighter weight at the same time, the heavier weight will fall faster, because intuitively it feels like that would make sense. Now, we know in a vacuum, in perfect conditions, dropping them at exactly the same time, they fall at exactly the same rate. But because they weren't working empirically, they were working more sort of philosophically, they quite often came to the wrong conclusions. And on atoms, no one walked away from the conversation about how many times can I cut the piece of marble until I get to something that's uncuttable. No one walked away from that and said, I'm now going to go do some experiments in chemistry to work out the nature of atoms. They walked away and then did a few more thought experiments and came up with some bonkers stuff about how bitter tastes are due to spiky atoms that prick your tongue, and how souls have atoms that can permeate physical objects if you stay in contact with them. Bonkers stuff. But you don't hear about that when people
talk about people. Atomic theory BC.
Yeah, but you don't hear about that when people talk about the Greeks came up with atomic theory. The Greeks didn't. The Greeks came up with kind of the concept and the word. Atomic theory began in the 18th century when people were doing some chemistry experiments, real science, and needed a word for these primary particles that they came up with. Right? So it's a slight digression, but I think it's important for us when we're thinking about any science that would have been done at the museum. It wasn't our science, and I think it's very important to keep in mind that this was not like a Google campus or a MIT where people were building flying machines and tinkering with technology, because the connection between science and technology is quite modern. And certainly in the ancient world, there are some exceptions, but most of these proto-scientists, most of these natural philosophers, were not doing this so that they can then go and make something. They were doing it, again, more as an abstract and philosophical exercise. So it wasn't as though they were discovering stuff and then going and finding a technological application for it. There were a couple of guys. Archimedes seems to have been one. Hero of Alexandria, who does seem to have worked at the museum, was another, who did a bit of tinkering. But on the whole, they weren't really doing a whole lot of technology. That wasn't something that high-minded, largely aristocratic philosophers did. That was something that artisans, peasants, and slaves did. So any technology that you've got in the ancient world is mainly stuff that people have come up with by trial and error, and was mainly not these guys. These guys were largely sitting around thinking lofty thoughts. They weren't building flying machines. And the other thing is that the ancient world had a massive labor surplus. They had millions of slaves, and their whole economy and their whole society was built on those slaves. There was a huge disincentive to come up with labor-saving technology. They did come up with some, but it wasn't a major thing that they needed to do.
There's less need for technical innovation in that respect.
Exactly. I mean, there's a story in Suetonius' 12 Caesars where he talks about how a guy came to the Emperor Vespasian and showed him how he'd come up with some mechanical way of hauling marble columns. And the emperor said, "That's very, very nice, and you're a very clever man. Here's some money for being so clever. But no, I don't want you to make this thing, because what will our slaves do?" And they were paranoid about slave revolts, Romans in particular, and that's why they repressed them so savagely. So the idea that this is another part of the myth, that somehow the Great Library was on the brink of a scientific revolution, but then the Christians came along and burned it down and pushed us into the Dark Ages, and so we're now 1,000 years behind where we would have been if the Great Library hadn't been destroyed. It's total bullshit. First of all, the Great Library wasn't a unique repository of ancient learning. There were thousands of other libraries that had similar information, and all of that information, basically, we're pretty clear on what it was, and they weren't on the brink of some kind of scientific revolution. I often get people pointing out, well, Hero of Alexandria invented the steam engine. Well, he didn't. He invented a little toy called an Aeopile, which basically is a sphere that you put water in. It's got a couple of little spouts on it. You put a flame on it, and it spins. I know.
Basically, it's a party trick.
It's a party trick, and that's exactly what it was used for. You put it in the middle of your table when you had a banquet, and everyone would sit around and applaud and say, "What a clever fellow you are." But what it couldn't do was actual mechanical work of any significant kind. And what the Romans, because by this stage is in the Roman period, what the Romans didn't have was the metals technology, so the metallurgy, to be able to produce proper steam pistons, the precision tooling to be able to actually make the things so that they don't explode, and the mathematics to be able to work out exactly what was going on physically in terms of the expansion of steam and so on. They weren't even close, and all that stuff came together over a much, much longer period, and largely came together because of economic factors, which is why the steam engine appeared when it did and not thousands of years earlier. People have got this sort of computer game idea that if you get this thing and this thing, they will immediately come together, and you'll have this technology. That's not how technology works. No. The main driver of technology is economics, which is why if you've got a massive labour surplus, there's not a big incentive to create, say, mechanical power. Whereas when you get a massive labour deficit, which happened at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and you get a great fragmentation of your economy, then what you've actually got is an incentive. And so what we see in the Middle Ages is the rise of mechanical power. First windmills, water mills, and then eventually it moves on into the Industrial Revolution. We've now drifted a long way from the Great Library, though. So
yeah, well, I think it's kind of important to talk about, though, because again, it's in this does play into a lot of the misconceptions that people have about the Great Library and
sure. Yeah,
and the ancient world in general.
Yeah. Well, this is a legacy of the Enlightenment. One of the things that happened in the Enlightenment was this sort of romantic view of the ancient world as being this wonderful pinnacle of wonderful wonderfulness, and then you had the Middle Ages that was bad, and now we are reviving the glories of Greece and Rome. That whole idea of good periods and bad periods of history has been totally rejected by historians over the last 200 years, but it still permeates popular culture. So you've still got this idea that Greece and Rome was this wonderful period of great rationality and science and so on, and then the Middle Ages was stupid and superstitious, and now we're kind of getting back to what Greece and Rome was. Complete crap. And actually, the Middle Ages was a period of great as I just mentioned, was a period of great technical innovation, and laid the foundations of what came after.
Or it's getting even worse at the moment, because you've got certain people on TikTok saying that Rome didn't even exist. So, good Lord. Let's not go down that route.
No. Okay, so just sort of thinking about the myths, the myth that it was unique, that's not true. The myth that it was, it was vast, well, it was big, but it wasn't anywhere near as big as people often maintain. The myth that it was a center of science and technology, well, it wasn't. They did some science, they did some tinkering, but it wasn't some kind of MIT or science center. But the biggest myth is how it was destroyed. So the
Mm.
the main version of this that you get is that a mob of Christians turned up. It's usually said to be sometime in the late 4th century. A mob of Christians turned up and burned it down because they hated learning and hated science, or they were just so stupid they didn't realize how important and wonderful it was. And often I saw someone make the mention before about Hypatia of Alexandria.
I did actually put a little response into there because
I saw that. Yeah.
I know there's some myths about Hypatia.
Yeah. So part of the myth is that Hypatia of Alexandria, who was a philosopher in late 4th, early 5th century Alexandria, was the last librarian of the Great Library. Sagan is almost entirely responsible for this this myth, though it's been recently re-perpetuated by the movie Agora, which starred Rachel Weisz, which was meant to be a biopic of Hypatia and was mostly historically nonsense. But there is no evidence that she had any connection to the Great Library. There's no evidence that she had any connection to any of the daughter libraries of the Great Library. This is pure fantasy. And it's trying to tie together sort of two sets of myths, because there's a whole lot of myths about Hypatia as well.
That could be a whole other stream, I think.
Yeah, but the idea that she was murdered because she was so wise and smart and Christians hated learning, it had nothing to do with that. It was a political squabble that she got caught up in. So back to the Great Library. How did it actually end? Well, the thing about it is that people like the idea of just, again, simple story, great big library, wonderfulness, science, fiery destruction in one great cataclysm. That's not what happened. So the first thing that happened was, we know that it was seriously damaged by Julius Caesar in the mid-1st century BC, or at least we can be reasonably sure. There's a whole lot of sources that talk
he got caught up in the civil war between Ptolemy and Cleopatra.
Yeah. So the famous Cleopatra and her little brother were struggling for the scraps of the Ptolemaic Empire.
I think the too long didn't read version of that is I believe Caesar he'd been in the civil war with Pompey the Great, who fled to Egypt. Caesar went after him. Ptolemy thought the best way he would get in with Caesar was to kill Pompey and present his head to him on a plate. Didn't have the desired effect, and then of course Cleopatra could offer Caesar something that the boy probably couldn't offer. So enough said. So
Cleopatra, I think Cleopatra kind of read the situation a bit better than her brother. So her brother misread the very honourable Roman and killed his enemy, which Caesar did not like. Whereas Cleopatra knew that Caesar was a randy bastard, and so they ended up having an affair. But what happened was that Caesar became part of the Alexandrian War, and in the process was laying siege to and assaulting Alexandria. His troops in the harbour of Alexandria came under fire by units of archers, and they responded by setting fire to some warehouses, some storehouses down on the docks. And what seems to have happened is that the part of the museum's book collection was actually stored there, and so those books were burned. That seems to be piecing together bits of evidence. The whole thing was a bit embarrassing, which is why writers during the reign of Caesar's successors kind of pretend it didn't happen, and we don't get explicit references to it until the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end and the Flavian dynasty began.
Yeah,
people start saying it out loud. Caesar basically fucking destroyed most of the collection of the Great Library.
Julius Caesar himself, if anyone knows anything about him, was even during his own life very good at, shall we say, promoting a positive image of himself. If anyone's read the Gallic Wars, it's
good at image control. Our main source on the Alexandrian War is actually from one of his generals, but he talks about the city getting set on fire during the siege. He doesn't talk about the library or its collection being damaged, and he makes a point of saying, but you couldn't really burn Alexandria because it's made of stone, which is an interesting comment to make. Given that he just talked about how it had just been set on fire. It sort of seems like he's skipping around what everyone kind of knew but didn't want to say out loud, that Caesar had actually badly damaged the Great Library. But I think there's a couple of points here to keep in mind. One is it shows us that the collection had become so big that it couldn't be maintained in the temple complex or the palace complex, and had to be stored elsewhere. We also know from other references, and I mentioned earlier, daughter libraries, so kind of other collections that were overflow collections from the museum's collection. These seem to be duplicates, and they were stored in other parts of the city. They were stored in libraries in temples. So one was stored after Julius Caesar's time in the temple to Julius Caesar, the Caesarion. And later on, the biggest one was stored in the temple of Serapis, which is also known as the Siparion or the Serapeum. We'll come back to the Serapeum when I'm talking about the ultimate fate of the library. So first major problem for the library seems to have been Caesar's fire.
Yeah. Now, I did hear that shortly afterwards, though, because obviously after Caesar's death, Mark Antony took up with Cleopatra. And I did hear that he either purchased or raided the Library of Pergamum to help replace some of the collection there. Is there any truth to that story? Or
look, we don't know. It's possible, because it's the kind of thing that certainly the kind of thing that Antony would do, and certainly the people of Alexandria would be very happy about stealing the collection from the Library of Pergamum. There might be an element of truth to it. It is told in the context of bad things that Mark Antony did that show that Mark Antony was a bad man and was mad and had become a kind of an Eastern despot. And so it was good that our wonderful Emperor Augustus defeated him at the Battle of Actium and founded the Roman Empire. Isn't Augustus wonderful? So we've got to be careful.
Yeah.
And there's an element of propaganda to it. But who knows? Who knows? It certainly sounds like the kind of thing that did happen, and the kind of thing that Antony would certainly do.
Might be some truth to it, maybe not. We don't know.
Could be. But what it shows is that the museum continued, and so there was still a book collection there. What seems to have happened, though, is that we no longer get references to it being the preeminent institution that it used to be. And we certainly don't get references to his book collection being the greatest in the world. So it does seem to have been the beginning of a centuries-long process of decline. What happened then, of course, as we just mentioned, was that Mark Antony gets defeated by Octavian, who becomes the Emperor Augustus, and Egypt gets brought into the Roman Empire as a province of the empire, which means that the Ptolemies aren't there anymore. And this vanity project of theirs, the Museon, becomes a vanity project of the Roman emperors, who aren't sitting in the royal palace right next door, but are sitting on the other side of the world. So it's not surprising that we then see evidence of decline in the museum, and therefore most likely in the book collection as well. The exception to that is the Emperor Claudius, who was a bit of a scholar. And he seems to have taken quite an interest in the museum. He expanded it. He added a wing. He also added to its collection, and he gave them copies of all of his books, because he was the author of quite a few books. He then mandated that there had to be a reading of all of his books once a year that everyone had to attend. That's the kind of thing you can do if you're an emperor and an emperor.
Yeah.
So
yes.
What we see from that is that there was still some sponsorship and patronage of the museum, and therefore of the library, by the Roman emperors. But what we also see is evidence that it was kind of on the slide. So whereas back in the days of the heyday of the Ptolemies, the directors of the library had always been preeminent scholars. Towards the end, they were less and less preeminent scholars. So at one point, this is before the Romans took over, the commander of the palace guard was also the director of the library. So it seems to have become a kind of a something that you gave to your mates as a bit of a reward, and was what we're seeing is a decline in prestige. We also get references by other scholars to the scholars of the museum as being pet birds in a gilded cage, and so they're kind of seen as being old-fashioned, out of touch, and in an ivory tower, and not really connected to what's really going on in the intellectual world. So again, we're getting evidence of decline. But what happened in the end? Well, what basically happened was that the Roman Empire very nearly fell apart in the 3rd century. So in the 3rd century, we had what's called the military anarchy. Basically, the Praetorian Guard and the army worked out that they were really the real power, and they could make or break emperors. And they also worked out that if they raised a new emperor, they got a cash bonus. So, they started raising emperors about once a year.
And I often wondered about that period. What after a while, I'd be like, so they'd be like, "Would you want to be emperor?" I'd be like, "No, thank you." It wasn't a long-term job.
We certainly do have evidence that that there were some guys who were approached and offered the job, and they said pretty much that. There were others who basically were forced to take the job at sword point.
Yeah.
But effectively, what happened in the mid 3rd century was that they kind of went through something like, I think it was 50 emperors in the space of 25 years. So it was pretty high turnover. And the empire started to break apart. So by the last third of the 3rd century, effectively the Roman Empire had broken into 3 bits. There was the central part. There was what was called the Empire of Gaul, which had kind of declared itself independent. And then there was the Kingdom of Palmyra, which was effectively
that included Britain, didn't it? The Empire of Gaul as well.
It did, yeah. The Empire of Gaul was Britain, most of Spain, and Gaul. And then they had the Kingdom of Palmyra. So the Queen of Palmyra, which is this desert kingdom out near Arabia, basically took advantage of the chaos, invaded the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and conquered most of it, including Egypt, and so including Alexandria. And what happened then was the Emperor Aurelian kind of staged a bit of a Roman comeback, and he stormed in 272. He stormed Alexandria to take it back from Zenobia and bring it back into the Roman Empire. And in the process, he burned the royal quarter, and the royal quarter was where the museum was. And that seems to have been pretty much the end of the museum. If it wasn't, there was at the end of the century, there was another sack of the royal quarter by the Emperor Diocletian to put down a rebellion in Egypt. And then there was an earthquake in the middle of the Mediterranean, which caused a tsunami, and the tsunami swamped most of the city of Alexandria, deposited large sailing ships up on top of 6-story buildings. It was a huge tidal wave, and it completely swamped the royal quarter. So you had 2 sacks and burnings, an earthquake, and a tidal wave. Not surprisingly, after that, we don't get any references to the museum. So that seems to be the end. We do get one reference. We get a reference to Hypatia's dad, actually. This is in the 4th century. He's referred to as the man from the museum, but that seems to be a nickname, and it seems to be a reference to, there's a couple of interpretations, but it seems to be a reference to him being a scholar in the old style. The museum doesn't seem to have existed past the end of the 3rd century. So this gets us back to Hypatia. Was she librarian of the Great Library? No, it ceased to exist before she was born, so she couldn't have been. So what you not got in any of that story is any Christians, because by this stage, 3rd century, Christianity is still a fairly small and, by the time of Diocletian, persecuted sect. So they're not in a position to be burning down great libraries. So where did the Christian part of the story come from? Well, that brings us back to those daughter libraries I was talking about before, the main one of which was the Serapeum. So this is the temple of Serapis. Serapis was a kind of a hybrid Greek and Egyptian god, and he was a kind of a combination of the god Osiris and Zeus. Very popular god, great big temple. had been rebuilt in the 2nd century. It was sitting up on a hill in what's called the lower city, but it's upper city, so away from the area that would have been burned by Aurelian Diocletian and swamped by the tidal wave. So that temple and its library survived, and it survived into the 4th century. And what happened was that in 381, a mob did turn up and tear down that temple. And this is where, we're getting back to Edward Gibbon, this is where Edward Gibbon gets the idea that, or tells the story of Christians destroying the last remnant of the Great Library, because the Serapeum contained libraries that were kind of like overflow from the Great Library. So he says, this was a terrible thing, and everyone lamented the empty shelves when these Christians stormed the Serapeum and tore apart the Great Library.
Greg, that one's more likely to be true, but
there's a problem with it too. There's a big problem.
No, I just responded to something that Greg said. Trump supporters destroyed the library because they're anti-intellects. So that's more likely to be true, but that's another topic for another stream.
Time traveling Trump supporters. So yes, the Serapeum was destroyed, and it was destroyed, I suppose we could say, by a mob of Christians, because by this stage Alexandria had become very much a centre of Christianity. And by the late 4th century, it was a majority Christian city. So there were still pagans, but most of the population by this stage were Christians. So why did they tear down this temple? Well, the bit that doesn't get told, but is actually fairly important to understand, is that it was torn down in a kind of a spasm of violence between Christians and pagans. So what was going on was the Christians were busily converting a lot of former temples into churches, because they were abandoned. As the population slowly converted, or actually quite rapidly converted to Christianity, lots of temples were falling apart because no one was maintaining them anymore. And so what was happening at one point was that Christians were renovating a temple and turning it into, not the Serapeum, another temple, and turning it into a church. And in the basement, they found a whole lot of pagan cult items, including an enormous penis. You couldn't make this stuff up. So they found this gigantic phallus, and they thought that was really funny. And so they started parading it through the street and mocking it and pelting it with rotten fruit and stuff and laughing. Some pagans weren't very happy about that because their sacred penis was being mocked. And so some of them got together a kind of a gang, and these weren't just guys from the street. These were leading philosophers, but they were philosophers from a very sort of militantly pagan school of Neoplatonic philosophy. And they formed a gang, holed up in the Serapeum, and would venture out at night, drag prominent Christians into the temple and torture them, and then crucify them and kill them, break their legs and throw them down a well. This went on for quite some time, and not surprisingly, the Christians, the majority of the population, weren't very happy about this gang of pagan terrorists killing some of their prominent citizens. Troops surrounded the temple, and there was a standoff. There was a bit of a siege, and both sides appealed to the emperor. So this must have gone on for quite a while, because the emperor was in Constantinople, so weeks voyage away.
This is after the formal split between East and West at this point.
West. Probably just before, but there were certainly two capitals at this
stage. Certainly around that time though.
Yeah. But so they appealed to the emperor, and then there was a standoff for weeks. The prefect of Alexandria didn't want to send the troops in and have a general massacre, but the crowd was baying for blood, and the pagans were holding out. The emperor then came back with a bit of a compromise. He said the pagan leaders can go free, so they won't be punished for what they've done, but the temple gets torn down, because I don't want it to be a focus of any further unrest. And so the troops moved in and started to tear down the temple. The pagan terrorist guys, they fled, understandably. the troops started to tear down the temple, and the crowd was so angry that the pagans had got away that they joined in. So this is why you've got a mob tearing down the Serapeum. It wasn't because they turned up one day and decided they wanted to destroy the centre of ancient learning. It was because of this street battle that had been going on for weeks, months probably. So the interesting thing about this is that this is actually a very well documented event. We've got 5 separate accounts of the destruction of the Serapeum, and none of them make any mention of a library. Now, sometimes people say, well, those are mostly Christian accounts. Sure, okay, but one of them isn't. One of them is a guy called Eunapius, and he was a pagan. He was very much pro the guys in the temple. He despised Christians, and he referred to the Christian mob as beasts in the form of men, and spent most of his account ridiculing how stupid and ignorant and dirty and horrible and moronic they were. Yet he doesn't make any mention. This guy's a philosopher. He doesn't make any mention of a library being destroyed. You'd think if it happened, you'd think if anyone was going to mention it would be Eunapius. So why? Because we know that there was a library there at the beginning of the 4th century. We're now at the end of the 4th century. Well, in between those 2 points, we have an account, a description of the Serapeum by Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a Roman historian. He was an ex-soldier. He was a pagan, and he seems to have visited Alexandria sometime about the mid-4th century, because he talks about having seen things in Egypt personally. And his description of the temple is quite detailed, and it doesn't match with any of the other ones. It seems to be an eyewitness description. In it, he says, it has held great libraries, using the past tense. So what seems to have happened is that there was a decline as the city became more Christian. There was a decline in funding for temples generally. And one thing about libraries is that they're bloody expensive things to maintain, particularly ancient libraries. Books fall apart, papyrus crumbles. You've got to be constantly recopying your books to keep the library up to date. So what seems to have happened is that the library declined, which means that the books probably just got sold off. We don't know, but it doesn't appear that there actually was a library when the Serapeum was destroyed at the end of the 4th century. But the destruction of the Serapeum is the origin of the myth of Christians burning down the Great Library, right? So you can sort of see how the legend grew. So it's possible that there was still some kind of library collection there, but just not significant enough for it to be mentioned.
It certainly wouldn't be. It certainly wasn't a great library by that point, even if there were books there. Yeah. No.
And the Serapeum was a shadow of the original museum collection anyway.
Yeah.
So that seems to be where the story came from. There's another story about the destruction of the Great Library, where the Muslims are the victim.
I have heard this one as well, but this one sounds very sketchy to me.
Yeah. So Alexandria and Egypt got conquered as part of the Muslim conquest in the 6th and 7th centuries. And the story goes that the Umar, the Muslim leader who conquered the city, was asked, "What do we do with all these books in this thing, the Great Library?" And he replied, "If the knowledge in them is already in the Quran, we don't need them. And if it isn't in the Quran, it's evil. So burn them." And so the books were used to heat his bathhouse. It's a good story. The only problem is none of the actual sources from the time of the conquest of Alexandria make any kind of mention of it. And it doesn't pop up until centuries later. And it's usually told by people who have got a bit of an anti-Muslim axe to grind.
I was going to say, from what I know about the sort of early Muslims eras, these people actually preserved a lot and translated a lot of the ancient works as well. So
later on, in the 7th century, they probably weren't as keen on what they considered to be pagan knowledge. But the story doesn't seem to be true. First of all, the Great Library didn't exist in the 7th century. It had ceased to exist, as I mentioned, back in the end of the 3rd century. So the idea that there was a Great Library there for the evil Muslim to burn in the first place is almost certainly crap. And secondly, it does seem to be a bit of propaganda folklore spread largely by Christians to make the Muslims look bad. So it doesn't seem to be true. Even Edward Gibbon thought it was crap, and Edward Gibbon was more than happy to accept most stories that are anti-religious. So what happened to the Great Library of Alexandria? It basically declined over a series of centuries, and then was a victim of the Roman civil wars of the 3rd century, and an earthquake and a tidal wave. That seems to be the end of it. Christians didn't destroy the Great Library of Alexandria. It's a myth.
Well, Tim, that's awesome. I mean, I've often heard you say that the real history is actually way more interesting than the fiction, and just sitting here talking to you for like the past hour or so, that is so definitely true. It is far more interesting than the fictional account, and it's really brilliant when you can get to sort of dive in and find this stuff out, and I know it, and obviously this is a big part of what you do is a lot of what's on your blog is actually trying to correct us atheists on some of our historical faux pas that we tend to make from time to time.
Sorry, we didn't stress at the beginning. We should have done it, Jeff. For those who don't know, I'm an atheist.
Yes. Contrary to popular belief, Tim is in fact an atheist.
Contrary to rumor, I'm an
so
atheist.
I got called an undercover Christian the other day myself for something else.
I get it about once a week. But you're right about the history, the real history being more interesting. But I think it's even more important if atheists are going to use history as a way of attacking religion, and I've got no problem with people doing that. That's fine, but you got to get it right. And just because a story was told by Carl Sagan, or just because it's a story that you like, doesn't absolve you of blame if you don't do your fact checking and then you get called on it. And sometimes I get people saying, well, you're saying the same things that Christians are saying. Yeah, that's because on some of this stuff, Christians aren't wrong. And if you don't want to be called out by Christians on getting stuff wrong, check the facts. I'm pretty uncompromising on this.
The fact of the matter is, there's plenty of stuff. At the end of the day, there is plenty of stuff they have done.
Exactly.
You can call them out on without calling them out on stuff they haven't done. So
we don't need to make stuff up or try and prop up legends. I just saw a comment in by Jenny. Was the library ever mentioned in the Bible? No, but we wouldn't expect it to. None of the books of the Bible are actually terribly interested in Ptolemaic Egypt. In fact, very few books of the Bible are actually written when Ptolemaic Egypt actually existed, so we wouldn't expect it to be mentioned. What is interesting, though, is that one of the references that we have to the Great Library is by a Christian writer talking about how the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was translated at the Great Library, or translated in the museum. We don't know if that's true, but it's probably the kind of thing that would have been done. And if it is true, it means that there were Jewish scholars working in the museum, which is interesting as well. The Septuagint was an extremely important book because Hebrew was not well known around the Mediterranean world, whereas Greek was the lingua franca. It was the language of literacy in the Mediterranean world for most of the Greco-Roman period. So the Septuagint made the Jewish scriptures available to a much wider audience. And whenever, for example, Paul in his epistles is quoting the Old Testament, he's actually using the Septuagint. So it seems that it was a major conduit for the ancient world for the spread of Christianity. So that's the connection between the Bible and or Bible and the Great Library. But no, it's not mentioned in the Bible. We wouldn't expect it to be.
Cool. So anything else you want to add on this, Tim, or?
No, unless people got some other questions.
If there's any questions for Tim in the chat at all, we'll give you a minute or two. But No, I definitely, whatever, Tim. We can't leave it. We have to get you back again, and we can't leave it so long next time.
We might. I mean, a sequel to this could be the myths of Hypatia, because that's one
Oh,
that
that
you see all the time. You know, Christians killed Hypatia because they hated her learning, and again, that's a lovely fairy tale. It's very popular. I see it all the
yeah,
time. It's not true. and,
yeah.
and the scholars who specialize in her life are constantly frustrated by the fact that that's what everyone thinks, and it's just not correct.
I was actually listening to you whilst I was doing some preparation for this. I was listening to some streams you'd been on, and I wanted to add a couple of things on where you said don't get your history from pop, like pop scientists, and don't get it from movies. I want to add two more onto this to that list. Don't get it from Assassin's Creed, and do not. And this one I cannot stress enough. What I'm about to say, I cannot stress this point enough. Do not get your history from Dan Brown novels. Cannot stress that point enough.
I can't stand Dan Brown. The man.
Oh God,
It's the only. The Da Vinci Code is the only book that I've physically hurled against a wall. And it's the only book in the world that I would actually encourage people to burn. It is, I mean, it's a bad novel. It's woefully badly written.
There's a British comedian called Stuart Lee who actually made this joke and said that because there was something with like in the Quran being burned or something. He says I don't agree with like holy books being burned, especially when there's like hundreds of copies of the pristine copies of the Da Vinci Code in Waterstones that deserve it.
Have to agree. Again, with Assassin's Creed, I mean, I mentioned before about people's idea of ancient technology and the history of technology via video games. Assassin's Creed, there's the one set in the ancient world, and I've seen people talking about how wonderful its reconstruction of the Great Library is. Its reconstruction of the Great Library is complete bollocks. So this idea that the Great Library was this sort of echoing hall with stacks of books in shelves right down the side and tables with scholars, which is our idea of a library. That's not what it would have looked like, because, as I mentioned, the Great Library is the collection of the museum. And we've got some idea of what the museum layout was. There was what was called an ex cathedra, or a kind of a lecture hall. There were little meeting rooms. There was a dining hall because they lived there. There were dormitories. But the main center of it was a kind of a courtyard with a colonnade around it. And that's where the scholars worked. And if you think about it, in the ancient world, when glass was very expensive and you couldn't make big panes of it, large windows were extremely difficult to make, which meant most interiors were quite dark, and the only way you could light them was with open flames. And open flames and books don't work very well together. So it made sense for them to be studying in this covered portico where they got shade because it was bloody hot in Egypt. But they got the light from the courtyard, a nice little garden there with mountains and so on. And they could sit there and
my internet crapped out for a second then.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, they had this sort of courtyard with this covered portico, and that's where they studied. The library, or at least the main working part of it, would have been in storerooms off from that portico. So the idea that there was this great big hall with lots and lots of books in shelves, our idea of the library, which is what you see in Assassin's Creed, it didn't look like that. So a lot of our ideas about and our conceptions of things like the Great Library, a lot of things in the ancient world, are actually quite wrong. But I would heartily endorse, don't get history from video games. Don't get it from movies. I mentioned the movie before, Agora. The first part of that movie is kind of set in a version of the Great Library, which again is, the echoing hall with books. And they have Hypatia as, working at the Great Library, which, as I've already mentioned, is complete bullshit. You really can't get your history from pop culture. The problem is most people do. So I'm constantly coming up against people saying things like, things like Hypatia discovered heliocentrism. She didn't. she was a commentator on Ptolemy, who was the guy who really crystallized the geocentric cosmology of the ancient world. But why do people get that idea? Because it's in the bloody movie. So, and over again, I find that all sorts of historical myths, when you trace them back, can be traced back to a novel, a book, a play, or a film. This happens all the time. So a lot of the myths about Galileo can be traced back to Bertolt Brecht's play. A lot of the myths about the papacy and the Nazis can be traced back to a German play called The Deputy by a guy called Hockworth. The idea that people in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat can be traced back to a Washington Irving book about Christopher Columbus from the early 18th century, early 19th century. So don't get your ideas about history from popular culture, and check your facts. Check what scholars say, and not scholars from the 18th century. So I often get people quoting Gibbon at me. Well, fine, that was cutting edge in 1776. It's fucking 2022. Get yourself up to date.
Oh, Tim, it's been fantastic having you on. I'm going to probably bring us to a close because my internet's deciding to be a bit funny at the moment. So but just to let you know, Tim's blog, historyforatheists.com. Tim, it's well worth checking out. Tim also has a podcast which you can find on his blog, and he also has History for Atheists YouTube channel now. Links for both his blog and the YouTube channel are in the description for this video. I really cannot emphasize, go and check some of Tim's stuff out. It's very rewarding.
Yeah, there's also a whole article on the Great Library on my blog in my section on the Great Myth, what I call the Great Myths. So the Great Myths 5 is on the Great Library, where all the stuff I just said is explained, but in much more detail, and also with reference to all the sources and to the scholarship that I'm relying on. I'm not making this stuff up, folks. This is
yes,
I've done my homework.
I can assure you that there is peer-reviewed source material to back up anything Tim is saying there. And to point something out here, Tim is not taking any position. Well, did my internet go again?
You just did a wonderful freeze frame, mate. You're looking very handsome. I was just saying that just so people know, what the stuff that's on your website is not controversial in historian circles at all. So no, look, thanks for that point, mate. I make a point of only presenting consensus, mainstream accepted views, and if I ever present anything other than that, I make a point of noting that. And if I ever present anything that's an idea of mine, I make sure I stress that. But I try not to do that at all. So what I'm presenting is what historians generally agree, which is, and I try to make it as up to date as possible as well.
Okay. Well, Tim, once again, thanks very much for coming on. Really pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, look, lovely to be back on the show, Jeff, and I'll be happy to come back on some other time, and I can drone on and on about something else to do with that.
We'll definitely do it. We'll definitely do it. So I might do myself a little after show in about like half an hour or something, or something if anyone's interested, and if my internet's not playing up. But otherwise, Tim, I'll go and let you enjoy the rest of your weekend. And thanks once again for getting up very early in the morning for you to do this.
No problem.
Very much appreciated.
Time to put my air conditioning on. It's bloody hot here, and I'll have some breakfast. But nice to talk to you, Jeff, and thanks for listening to everyone in the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to everyone who's been either been in the chat or been listening in, lurking. This is just Jeff, God the Scummer. We'll see you all later.
See ya.